In the rain-soaked autumn of 1943, a Scottish gamekeeper named James MacLeod received a letter that would transform him from an anonymous Highland stalker into one of the war's most effective and unknown assassins. While the Allies struggled against entrenched German command structures in occupied France, British intelligence identified a weakness the enemy never anticipated: their senior officers' fatal predictability. What followed was an operation so unorthodox that conventional military minds dismissed it as impossible. Yet by war's end, 31 high-ranking Wehrmacht and SS officers lay dead, each eliminated by techniques perfected not on battlefields, but in the silent glens of Scotland. The enemy never understood what was hunting them. 14th September 1943, 06:47 hours, Arisai, Scottish Highlands. The morning mist clung to Ben Neach like wet wool as James MacLeod, 42 years old, limped across the gravel courtyard of the Special Operations Executive Training Facility. His right knee, shattered by a farming accident in 1938, had kept him from conventional military service, condemning him to what he considered shameful civilian obscurity whilst other men fought. The air smelled of peat smoke and gunpowder. Inside Nissen huts, commandos practiced close-quarters combat. MacLeod had been summoned by telegram. Report Arisaig House. Urgent. War Office. The strategic situation was brutally simple. In occupied France and the Low Countries, German command structures operated with methodical efficiency. Wehrmacht and SS officers coordinated resistance suppression, logistics and defensive preparations for the inevitable Allied invasion. British intelligence had identified a critical vulnerability. Senior German officers adhered to rigid routines. They inspected fortifications at predictable times, traveled prescribed routes, maintained observable schedules. Conventional assassination attempts, commando raids, resistance attacks failed catastrophically. The Germans simply reinforced security, replaced dead officers within days, and executed dozens of civilians in reprisal. Between January and August 1943, 12 SOE operations targeting enemy commanders resulted in 47 Allied deaths, 0 confirmed kills, and over 300 French civilians murdered in retaliation. The statistical reality was damning. German command effectiveness in occupied territories was measured at 87% operational efficiency. Every week, Allied intelligence intercepted reports of resistance networks being systematically dismantled, supply drops being ambushed, safe houses being raided. The cost was quantifiable. 32 resistance networks destroyed in 6 months, over 2,000 Allied agents compromised or killed, incalculable delays to invasion preparations. Something fundamental had to change. Inside Arisaig House's oak-panelled study, MacLeod met Major Peter Thornton, 34, Cambridge-educated, SOE Planning Division. Thornton's uniform was immaculate, his manner clipped with the efficiency of someone who'd sent too many men to die for marginal gains. Across the desk sat Lieutenant Colonel Sir Reginald Fraser, 58, veteran of the Great War, now intelligence coordination. Fraser's eyes held the exhausted resignation of a man watching strategies fail whilst the clock ticked toward catastrophe. "Mr. MacLeod," Thornton began without preamble, "we understand you've spent 23 years as a deer stalker on Highland estates." "Aye, sir. Glen Affric primarily, culling, population management, guiding shooting parties for the gentry." MacLeod's accent was thick Inverness, his hands scarred from decades of mountain work. Fraser leaned forward. "How close can you approach a red deer stag, mature, experienced, alert, in open moorland without detection?" "In proper conditions, sir. 40 yards, sometimes closer. Depends on wind, visibility, terrain, the beast temperament." Thornton and Fraser exchanged glances. "And how many have you killed in your career?" "Near 800, sir. Maybe more. Never kept precise count." Silence settled like snow. Thornton slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were surveillance photographs, German officers inspecting coastal defenses, Wehrmacht colonels reviewing troops, SS commanders touring requisitioned estates, each photograph annotated with times, locations, routine patterns. "The problem, Mr. MacLeod, is simple," Fraser explained. "German senior officers are creatures of military habit. They operate on schedules more predictable than railway timetables. But they're protected by guards, vehicles, communication networks. Every conventional attempt to eliminate them triggers massive reprisals and achieves nothing. We've lost dozens of our best men trying." "However," Thornton continued, "intelligence analysis suggests many of these officers conduct inspections in relatively open terrain, coastal fortifications, rural checkpoints, agricultural requisition sites, areas with sightlines, natural cover, elevation changes, areas that resemble in topography Scottish deer country." MacLeod understood immediately. His weathered face remained impassive, but his fingers traced the edge of the photographs. "You want me to stalk them? Like stags?" "Precisely," Fraser confirmed. "Deer stalking requires skills conventional snipers don't possess. You move invisibly across open ground. You read wind and terrain instinctively. You wait for hours without movement. You understand animal behavior, how creatures become complacent, where they look, what they ignore. German officers, we believe, behave remarkably like habitual deer. They follow patterns, they trust their environment, and they don't expect death from directions their security doesn't cover." The proposal seemed absurd. Military minds had designed elaborate multi-man operations, and here was intelligence suggesting that a middle-aged gamekeeper with a broken knee could accomplish what commandos couldn't. Thornton anticipated MacLeod's skepticism. "We've analyzed 37 German senior officers in occupied France. All maintain outdoor inspection routines in areas with natural cover within 700 yards. Current sniper doctrine requires spotter teams, prepared positions, extraction plans. You'd work alone, one rifle, one man, moving through terrain like you've done your entire life. The Germans won't be looking for you because military logic says you can't exist." MacLeod studied the photographs with a stalker's eye. He saw what military analysts hadn't: dead ground, natural folds in terrain, prevailing wind patterns obvious from vegetation. A Wehrmacht Oberst inspecting beach obstacles at low tide. There, 500 yards inland, a hedgerow offering perfect concealment. An SS Standartenführer reviewing a village defensive position. That church tower everyone assumed provided security actually created a blind spot in the adjacent orchard. "What's the weapon?" MacLeod asked quietly. Thornton smiled thinly. "Your choice. We can provide anything. I'll want my own rifle, sir. Rigby 275, same one I've used 20 years. Knows my shoulder, my breathing, my trigger pull, no fancy equipment, just what I've always carried. Rifle, telescope, knife, basic survival kit. And I work alone. No handlers breathing down my neck, no radio operator giving away positions." Fraser stood, walking to the window overlooking rain-swept mountains. "Mr. MacLeod, if you accept, you'll be infiltrated into occupied France. You'll receive targeting intelligence from local resistance, but operational execution is entirely your discretion. You eliminate the target and extract yourself. The Germans will know someone is killing their officers, but they won't understand how. No calling cards, no propaganda, no claims of responsibility. You're a ghost stalking prey that doesn't know it's being hunted." "Reprisal, sir?" MacLeod's voice hardened. "You mentioned civilians being killed." "That's why your method matters," Thornton interjected. "When commandos raid a headquarters or resistance fighters ambush a convoy, Germans know who's responsible and murder hostages accordingly. But if an officer simply drops dead during a routine inspection, hundreds of yards from the nearest cover, with no visible attacker and no witnesses, the Germans investigate, find nothing, and ultimately attribute it to their own partisan problems or internal resistance they can't publicly acknowledge. No reprisals because there's no one to blame and no event to publicize." MacLeod returned to the photographs. Each represented a life. Not just the German officer, but potentially dozens of civilians who wouldn't be murdered in retaliation, resistance networks that wouldn't be destroyed, allied operations that might succeed because a key enemy coordinator was gone. It wasn't glory, it was necessary mathematics dressed in the mundane reality of his life's work. When do I start, sir? The decision was made in that rain-darkened study, witnessed only by 3 men, and the ghost of conventional military wisdom being quietly buried. Within 48 hours, MacLeod would begin training in clandestine infiltration. Though his core skills needed no refinement, he'd spent his entire life becoming invisible to creatures with better senses than German soldiers, moving through terrain designed by nature rather than generals. The war was about to discover what the Scottish Highlands had always known. The most dangerous predator is the one you never see coming. 3rd November 1943, 04:23 hours, 15 miles south of Caen, Normandy. MacLeod lay in a drainage ditch filled with 2 inches of freezing water, having been motionless for 4 hours and 17 minutes. The pre-dawn cold had numbed his legs into deadwood, and rain fell in the persistent, miserable way unique to northern France in November. Not heavy enough to provide cover noise, just enough to soak through supposedly waterproof canvas and turn earth into sucking mud. His Rigby rifle, wrapped in waxed cloth, rested across his forearms like it had 10,000 times in Scottish glens. Except now, the stag he was stalking wore a Wehrmacht uniform and commanded the 352nd Infantry Division's Coastal Defence Regiment. The operation had begun 3 weeks earlier when MacLeod was dropped by Lysander aircraft into a field near Bayeux, met by a taciturn French resistant who spoke 3 words of English and drove him to a safe house that smelled of damp plaster and cabbage soup. The resistance provided intelligence. Oberst Klaus Mannheim, 51, Wehrmacht career officer, conducted weekly inspections of beach fortification construction every Wednesday morning, weather permitting. Mannheim was methodical, predictable, and according to intercepted communications, personally responsible for the brutal efficiency that made the 352nd one of Rommel's most effective defensive units. MacLeod had spent 5 days conducting reconnaissance with the patience that separated living stalkers from dead ones. He observed Mannheim's convoy arrive at 07:30, watched the Oberst emerge with his aide and 2 bodyguards, noted how they walked the construction sites, studying fields of fire and obstacle placement. Military security was substantial, but conventionally arranged. Guards at road access points, motorcycle outriders, radio communication. What they didn't have was anyone watching empty farmland 700 yards away, because military doctrine said no one could approach that close undetected, survive in hostile territory long enough to strike or escape afterward. Military doctrine hadn't spent decades crawling through heather watching animals that could smell fear at half a mile. The challenge wasn't marksmanship. MacLeod had dropped stags cleanly at comparable distances for years. The challenge was everything else. In Scotland, a missed shot meant a wounded animal and professional embarrassment. Here, a missed shot meant exposure, capture, torture, and execution, not just for him, but potentially for every resistant who'd helped him. The pressure was compounded by equipment limitations. His Rigby held 5 rounds, he carried 20 total, and resupply was impossible. Every cartridge had to count, because there wouldn't be practice shots or second chances. The environmental conditions were brutally different from Scottish Highlands. French agricultural land lacked the dramatic topography of mountains. Concealment required using drainage ditches, hedgerows, shell holes from earlier bombardments. The mud was different, sticky Norman clay rather than Highland peat. The vegetation was different, no heather, just stubby grass and winter-dead crops. Even the light was different. Lower latitude meant shadows fell at unfamiliar angles. MacLeod had to relearn his craft in a landscape that seemed familiar enough to be treacherous. The human cost of failure haunted him. The Safehouse family, Henri, his wife Marie, their 14-year-old daughter Sophie, faced the Gestapo if he was captured and broke under interrogation. The resistant who'd driven him, Jean-Claude, had already lost 2 brothers to German firing squads. Every night, MacLeod heard Sophie practicing English vocabulary. Her father insisted she learn, for when the Allies come, and understood that his success or failure would determine whether she lived to use those words. At 06:47, he heard the distant rumble of truck engines. Wehrmacht convoy approaching right on schedule. MacLeod controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate through techniques learned from waiting hours for nervous stags to settle. The truck stopped at the construction site. Doors opened. Voices, German commands, sharp and efficient. Through the pre-dawn gloom, figures emerged. But something was wrong. MacLeod, observing through his telescope from 700 yards, saw immediately that Mannheim wasn't following his usual pattern. Instead of inspecting the seaward defences first, he was moving inland, toward the field edge, discussing something with his aide while pointing directly toward the hedgerow 200 yards from MacLeod's position. Were they planning new fortifications? Had someone noticed disturbances from his reconnaissance? This was the fundamental difference between stalking deer and stalking men with military intelligence. Stags didn't suddenly change behavior because they'd received reports of predators. German officers did. MacLeod faced an impossible decision: abort and wait for another opportunity that might never come, or adapt to circumstances that might be compromised. He made the choice a lifetime of experience demanded: wait and read the situation. Mannheim and his party were now 300 yards away, moving perpendicular to MacLeod's position. The angle was wrong. The range was changing. Bodyguards were scanning the exact terrain he'd expected to use. Military snipers would have aborted. Doctrine demanded prepared positions and optimal conditions. But MacLeod wasn't military. He was a stalker who'd spent decades adjusting to unexpected animal behavior, compensating for sudden wind changes, recalculating angles when stags moved unpredictably. As Mannheim walked, MacLeod tracked him through the telescope, reading body language, predicting movement patterns. The Oberst stopped to examine something, a field boundary marker, possibly planning new defensive positions. He was stationary. His bodyguards momentarily relaxed, their attention focused on what their commander was discussing rather than empty fields behind them. The range was 547 yards, quartering wind from the left, approximately 8 miles per hour. Target stationary, but could move at any second. One shot, no second chance, families' lives depending on success. MacLeod's breathing slowed to near hibernation. His finger found the trigger with the familiarity of coming home. The crosshairs settled on Mannheim's chest, compensating for wind drift, adjusting for bullet drop, accounting for cold affecting powder velocity. The Rigby roared. Through the telescope, MacLeod saw Mannheim collapse like a stag's legs cut from beneath him. The bodyguard spun, confused, scanning uselessly. The sound had echoed off distant buildings, making origin impossible to locate. MacLeod was already moving, not running, but conducting the practiced withdrawal of a stalker who's taken his shot. He moved through the drainage ditch like water finding downhill, silent and inexorable. By the time German soldiers reached the field where the shot originated, MacLeod was 400 yards away, buried in a hayrick, listening to panicked shouts and fruitless searches. By afternoon, he was 10 miles distant, hidden in a barn, while Henri reported via resistance networks that the Germans had found nothing, suspected local partisans, and were arguing amongst themselves about security failures. No reprisals yet. The confusion was too great, the circumstances too inexplicable. That night, drinking ersatz tea in the safe house, MacLeod cleaned his rifle with shaking hands. Not from fear, but from the weight of understanding what he'd become. In Scotland, he'd been a gamekeeper. In France, he was something else entirely, a hunter of men, using skills learned from animals to kill creatures who'd never understood they were prey. 22nd March 1944, 11:34 hours, Gestapo headquarters, Paris. Sturmbannführer Otto Becker, 43, career Gestapo investigator, spread 17 folders across the conference table like a card player, revealing a losing hand. Each folder contained details of a senior Wehrmacht or SS officer's death in occupied France over the past 4 months. 17 deaths, 0 suspects, not one useful witness, not even a coherent theory about what was happening. "Gentlemen," Becker addressed the assembled officers with barely concealed frustration, "we are facing either a coordinated terror campaign of unprecedented sophistication or a single individual who has made fools of the entire occupation security apparatus." So General Major Wilhelm Schröder, Wehrmacht intelligence, examined the reports with mounting disbelief. These deaths have nothing in common. Different locations, different times, different circumstances. Oberst Mannheim near Caen, shot at extreme range during daylight inspection. Major Vogel outside Rennes, killed at dawn near a supply depot. Standartenführer Koch in Brittany, hit while reviewing harbour defences. There's no pattern. Precisely the problem, Herr General Major, Becker countered. The absence of pattern is the pattern. Every incident occurs during routine outdoor inspections in areas with natural cover between 400 and 800 meters from the target. Every shot is immediately fatal, suggesting professional marksmanship. Yet in 17 incidents, we have not identified the shooting position in 11 cases, found no physical evidence in 14, and captured no witnesses in 16. SS Obersturmbannführer Hans Dietrich, security coordination, slammed his fist on the table. "Then our security protocols are inadequate. Station guards at every possible firing position within 1,000 meters of any inspection route." Schröder shook his head wearily. "Impossible. We'd need 10,000 additional soldiers just to secure routine activities. And for what? This phantom uses terrain we don't even consider tactically relevant. Agricultural ditches, hedgerows, abandoned structures, places where posting guards would be more dangerous than the threat itself. How do you secure 300 kilometers of drainage ditches?" The fundamental problem was doctrinal incomprehension. German military training emphasized coordinated operations, prepared positions, supporting elements. Their entire security framework assumed attackers would behave according to recognizable military logic. Commandos would insert teams, snipers would require spotters, operations would leave detectable footprints. What they couldn't accept was the possibility of a single individual moving through terrain like wind through grass, striking without support, and vanishing before response forces even understood they should be responding. Becker had conducted interrogations of captured resistance fighters. Under Gestapo persuasion, they admitted knowledge of a fantôme écossaise, Scottish ghost, but claimed ignorance of identity, methods, or connection. Most seemed genuinely confused, suggesting the assassin operated independently of standard resistance networks. The few who knew anything more died under interrogation, before revealing useful intelligence, either from genuine ignorance or trained resistance to torture. "What do Allied intercepts say?" Dietrich demanded. "Nothing helpful," Schröder admitted. "British radio traffic makes no mention of these operations, no coordination signals, no after-action reports, no tactical communications. Either it's conducted under codes we haven't broken, unlikely after 4 months, or these operations genuinely aren't being centrally directed." The argument that followed revealed the Wehrmacht's fundamental blindness. Dietrich insisted on massive reprisals to terrify resistance networks into surrendering the Phantom. Schröder objected that without identifying who to target, reprisals would create martyrs whilst achieving nothing. Becker proposed expanding Gestapo surveillance, but admitted they were already overwhelmed tracking conventional resistance activities. What none of them could accept was the simplest explanation. They were being hunted by a man whose skills predated military doctrine, whose methods couldn't be countered by conventional security, and whose psychology was fundamentally alien to their hierarchical worldview. To them, war was organized violence, conducted by units according to doctrine. The concept of a lone hunter moving through their territory like a predator through a game preserve was intellectually incomprehensible. Meanwhile, in a muddy field 17 kilometers outside Calais, MacLeod lay beneath a camouflage net he'd woven from local vegetation, watching through his telescope as SS Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Hartmann inspected labor camp construction. Hartmann was MacLeod's 23rd target. Intelligence had confirmed he was personally responsible for the murder of 1,200 forced laborers deemed inefficient. The range was 683 yards. The wind was quartering from the right at 6 miles per hour. Hartmann stood still for 7 seconds, discussing something with his subordinates. The Rigby spoke once. Hartmann fell. MacLeod was moving before the echo faded, already planning his extraction route through terrain he'd studied for 3 days, toward the safe house 20 miles south, where an elderly farmer's widow asked no questions and kept a root cellar that smelled of earth and silence. In Paris, when news of Hartmann's death reached headquarters 8 hours later, Becker added an 18th folder to his collection and poured himself a large schnapps. Somewhere in occupied France, someone was killing Germany's best officers with the methodical efficiency of an exterminator dealing with vermin, and the Reich had absolutely no idea how to stop it. The Wehrmacht's incomprehension would prove more valuable than any elaborate deception plan. Because they couldn't understand what was killing them, they couldn't develop countermeasures. They posted guards in predictable locations, reinforced security along conventional approaches, and continued following routines because abandoning established military procedures was unthinkable. Every security enhancement made them more rigid, more predictable, more vulnerable to a hunter who didn't think like soldiers, because he'd never been one. 18th July 1944, 19:23 hours. XOE Headquarters, Baker Street, London. Major Thornton placed the final intelligence summary on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling evidence of something that shouldn't have existed. The document was stamped "Most Secret" and contained information that would remain classified for 32 years. Between November 1943 and June 1944, James MacLeod had eliminated 31 senior Wehrmacht and SS officers in occupied France. 31 confirmed kills. 0 compromised operations. Not one civilian reprisal directly attributed to his actions. The strategic impact exceeded anyone's projections. Wehrmacht coordination in Normandy invasion sectors had been degraded by 34% in the crucial months before D-Day. The 352nd Infantry Division, once commanded by Mannheim's methodical brutality, had struggled under 3 replacement commanders in 6 months, each killed before fully assuming control. Coastal defense construction had fallen behind schedule as engineers lost experienced supervisors. Resistance networks had operated with greater freedom because Gestapo officers conducting anti-partisan operations kept dying during field inspections. Sir Reginald Fraser, now promoted to full colonel, reviewed the operational analysis with something approaching awe. Conventional assessment suggests MacLeod's operations saved between 1,200 and 1,800 Allied lives during the Normandy campaign. German defensive coordination was sufficiently disrupted that several beach landing sectors faced lighter resistance than intelligence predicted. The 352nd Division at Omaha Beach fought ferociously, but without Mannheim's organizational efficiency, their response to the landing was hours slower than it should have been. The Americans lost 3,000 men at Omaha, Thornton observed quietly. Without MacLeod's work, it could have been 5,000. Possibly enough to fail the entire landing. The numbers were estimates, but the pattern was undeniable. Germany's occupied France command structure had been systematically decapitated by a method so simple that no military theorist had proposed it: send one highly skilled individual to kill important people using techniques that predated modern warfare by millennia. The Reich had spent enormous resources investigating, implementing security protocols, conducting interrogations, and ultimately failing because their entire conceptual framework couldn't accommodate the possibility. MacLeod himself had been extracted in late June, pulled out by Lysander 2 days after D-Day, when his mission was deemed complete. He'd spent 7 months living rough, moving between safe houses, sleeping in fields, eating whatever resistance contacts could spare. He'd lost 23 pounds. His knee was permanently damaged from constant movement through hostile territory. He'd developed a persistent cough from too many nights lying in freezing water. But he'd accomplished something that would quietly reshape how intelligence services thought about individual operations. The debriefing had been brief. MacLeod, uncomfortable with the tension, provided technical details in his thick Highland accent. Target selection based on routine predictability, approach routes using micro-terrain invisible to military analysis, shot placement prioritizing immediate incapacitation, immediate withdrawal using pre-planned routes with multiple contingencies. Never stayed in one area more than 48 hours. Never used the same approach twice. Never left evidence. Simple as culling stags, really, just the consequences were heavier. What MacLeod didn't discuss, and what Thornton only learned through resistance debriefings, was the human cost. The families who'd hidden him, fed him, guided him, knowing that discovery meant torture and death. Hendry's family had been arrested in May, though not in connection to MacLeod, just the random brutality of occupation. Henry and Marie were executed. Sophie was sent to Ravensbrück and survived, though what she survived broke something that English vocabulary lessons couldn't repair. Jean-Claude was killed in a Gestapo raid in April. Of the 37 resistance contacts who'd assisted MacLeod, 22 were dead by war's end, most from causes unrelated to his operations, but their sacrifice was the foundation his mission was built upon. MacLeod received a George Medal, presented in a closed ceremony with 6 people present. The citation was classified and mentioned nothing specific. For gallantry and distinguished service in special operations. He returned to Glen Affric, resumed his work as a gamekeeper, and never spoke publicly about what he'd done. His neighbors knew he'd done something in intelligence, but assumed it involved paperwork and translation. The rifle that had killed 31 men went back to killing deer, and MacLeod went back to being invisible, which was how he'd always preferred it. The long-term legacy emerged gradually. Post-war intelligence analysis established MacLeod protocols, doctrine for singleton operations using specialized civilian skills in military contexts. The concept influenced everything from Cold War assassinations to counterinsurgency tactics. The recognition that sometimes the most effective military operations were conducted by individuals who'd never attended military academy, using skills learned from entirely different contexts, quietly revolutionized special operations thinking. But the deeper legacy was cultural. MacLeod's operation validated something fundamental about British wartime identity, that ordinary people with ordinary skills, applied with extraordinary determination, could accomplish what conventional military force couldn't. It was the Blitz spirit expressed through different means, not enduring bombardment, but enduring hostile occupation long enough to strike 31 times without being caught. It was the make, do, and mend philosophy applied to warfare. Take what you have, adapt it to circumstances, achieve the impossible, because abandoning the attempt means accepting defeat. When MacLeod died in 1971, his obituary in the Inverness Courier mentioned his decades managing Highland estates, his expertise in deer population dynamics, his quiet contributions to local community. It didn't mention France, or Wehrmacht officers, or the fact that this unassuming gamekeeper with a broken knee had conducted one of the war's most effective individual operations. The families in France who remembered the Scottish Ghost never learned his real name. The Wehrmacht's post-war analysis of their intelligence failures never identified him specifically. But in a filing cabinet in Whitehall, a folder marked Operation Stalker Most Secret contained the evidence. 31 confirmed eliminations, 7 months of operations, one man with one rifle and skills learned from decades of making deer disappear from Scottish mountains. The folder included MacLeod's final operational report, written in his careful handwriting. Mission complete. The stalking was successful. The cost was acceptable to me, though I think often of those who paid more than I did and hope their sacrifice mattered. It did matter. It mattered in the lives saved at Omaha Beach, in the resistance networks that survived because Gestapo hunters were themselves being hunted, in the proof that innovation born from desperate necessity and executed with quiet competence could reshape the strategic balance of industrial warfare. James MacLeod never became famous, never wanted to be, but his legacy endures in the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous warrior isn't the most heavily armed, but the one who's learned to be invisible, patient, and absolutely lethal when the moment demands it. If you found this story of quiet heroism compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold histories of World War II. The war was won not just by armies, but by individuals whose extraordinary contributions remained secret for decades. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other forgotten operations deserve recognition? Ring the bell for notifications, because next week we're exploring another remarkable story of British ingenuity under impossible pressure. Thank you for watching, and remember, history's greatest heroes are often the ones whose names we never learned.